Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some features of poetry that are really important to poetry, and they're going to kind of help us take a poem apart and really see where the meaning is. So, the first thing I want to tell you about poetry is that titles matter. A lot of times we glance over titles and we try to get right to the story or the poem or the article, and we don't look at the title closely enough. Um, I've had this book by Clint Smith, Counting the Scent. It's a collection of his poetry for a long time. It's here on the slide as well. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't read this poem the first time I picked up the book. And it's because two things. One, it was a really long title, and just like you guys, I see a long title and I'm kind of like, over it and move on. And the other thing was I didn't understand what the title was telling me. And it wasn't honestly until I saw Clint Smith perform this poem live um, at a teachers conference last year that I thought, man, this is an awesome poem. I got to use it. So I'm embarrassed to tell you that. That's my true confession. But it's another example of how important titles are, and how even English teachers sometimes glance over titles. So the title of the poem is "When Maze and Frankie Beverly Come On in My Kitchen," right? And the first thing is, you may not know who Maze and Frankie Beverly are. I do not. They are a musical group, 70s kind of soul, R&B kind of music. You might have had a chance to listen to them in the lesson. But if you don't know that, then this title doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so when they come on in my kitchen, so now we know that music is playing in somebody's kitchen, and that's a huge clue as to what's going on in this poem right away. So titles matter. Read them, even if they look a little bit confusing because you don't know everything in the title, or if they're a little long, doesn't matter. Read the title, okay, guys? Okay, so titles matter. The next thing you need to know is the speaker. We got to always be thinking about who the speaker is in a poem. And very simple, the speaker is the narrator in the poem. All right, it's a separate personality that the poet creates to talk about whatever is happening in the poem. And just like a narrator in a novel or a short story, has a certain personality and feels a certain way about whatever they're talking about or the characters in the story they're telling, the speaker in a poem feels a certain way about whatever they're talking about in the poem. So you got to be looking for those little clues to their personality and their feelings about that. And we cannot assume that the poet is the speaker, that these are one and the same. So we might jump to conclusions about gender, that it's a he or she based on the name of the poet, but we can't do that. There are poets. I'm sorry, a lot of poems about animals, and the poet um, personifies the animals. So the speaker is clearly not the poet because the poet is not a dog, right? But the speaker is the dog. The fictional narrator of the poem is the dog. So it's the other thing. We got to think about who's um, telling the story in the poem. That's our speaker. All right. The next thing is occasion. And that sounds pretty fancy too, maybe, but all that means is what is the event or memory or maybe even object that the poem is describing? Okay. What's happening in the poem? And then how does the speaker feel about that event or memory? And that's it. What is the event or memory? And then how does the poet feel about it? So in this poem here, the event is um, a kid watching his parents dance to music, Amazing Frankie Beverly, while cooking dinner or some meal, and he's just watching. Right, his parents kind of get silly and show some loving connection towards each other. So that's an example of the occasion. Okay, and he seems to feel pretty good about that, but we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, the last thing is shift, and a shift is merely a transition. So um, in an essay, we use paragraphs, or even in fiction, we use paragraphs to show a transition between topics or ideas. Um, and we also might use organizational patterns in those to show the difference between topics and ideas. And in poetry, we use a couple different techniques. So the first thing is the shift is just, it could be a change in topic, right? I was talking about um, music, and now I'm talking about sports. It could be that. Or I'm talking about my mom, and now I'm talking about my dad, as we see in this poem. It could also be a change in tones or feeling about the topic. So at the beginning, the speaker might sound frustrated, and then later on they sound relieved, or they might be confused, and then they have a realization they figure out something. Okay, so change in tone or feelings about the same topic. You might also see a change in rhyme if it's a poem that rhymes. That's another big clue. Or if it stops rhyming, that's another big clue that things are changing. And a good place to always look for changes is the stanzas. Okay, whenever a poet changes stanzas, that's almost like paragraphs, right, in poetry. And so when we change stanzas, we might be changing that topic or the tone. So whenever you see that break, that's a good place to look and say, hey, something might be changing here. So those are just some things to think about as we go into this poem. If we can figure out those things, importance of title, speaker, occasion, and shift, man, we are so far ahead of the game. Poems, which may seem really confusing and scary at first because of how vague they are, those things will give us a lot of clues as to what the poet is trying to say and what they're trying to get us, the audience, to get out of their poem.